Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to my third and final installment of my expatriation policy training program. Thank you for joining me and for taking so much time out of your semester to learn about expatriation. So first and foremost, I want to talk to you and just kind of get a feel for how you feel about expatriation, kind of what your understanding is. How do you feel about it?
I probably should be reminded of what it is.
So at the last presentation, we talked about expatriation being someone who's residing in another country or culture, whether that's temporarily or on a more permanent basis, as a result of a career assignment. So this is something you're probably going to hear a lot about if you're working in a multinational or international firm in the human resources department, but otherwise you're probably not going to hear a whole lot about it unless you're an expatriate yourself. So we talked about the fact that expatriation assignments can have pretty high failure rates as a result of poor planning on the part of the employer. So in a new culture, you not only have entirely different cultural norms, but there is a potential for all kinds of new languages that you maybe haven't been exposed to before. Cultural norms tell people in that country or that culture what's socially acceptable. So for instance, I'm sure you may have heard before that it's socially acceptable in a lot of places in Europe to greet each other with a peck on the cheek. Likewise, when dealing in international business in certain cultures, business people are expected to make pleasantries before they are discussing business matters. So you might be able to imagine what would happen if you don't know the cultural norms of your new work environment. This also applies to your social or personal lives. So we touched pretty briefly on benefits expatriates can receive, and these were things like better salaries than that of your home location, even when you're doing the same work, living allowances, and paid childcare. I gave some brief statistics, which really just reinforce that expatriate programs fail due to mostly the inability for an employee or his or her family to adapt. I also touched on a few places that are higher ranking in terms of expatriate success rates. These were rated on things such as cost of living, personal finance, and quality of life. Ecuador and Mexico were the two that I discussed previously. We talked about in these expatriate assignments previously that personal life would be impacted first and foremost. I think that's probably true for everyone in an expatriate assignment. But without proper training to get you kind of through that initial period, your professional life is probably going to start to be impacted negatively as well. And I think that's where a solid expatriation policy comes into play for the employer, from the employer. So with that in mind, we'll recap some of the best practices for ensuring a good expatriation program is in place for an organization. So the first practice, according to worldatwork.org, is in understanding that very few employees' opinions on expatriation are actually swayed by international events. While it's probably true that most employees would be opposed to expatriating to a high-risk area, the general consensus in this study found that employees would feel secure in knowing that there's a good hazard management plan in place by the employer. Another best practice is making sure that you're understanding the motivations of your employees and their reasons for accepting these assignments in the first place. So in my first presentation, I discussed one of the benefits of expatriation as having a potential for a higher salary than you would in your home location while you're doing the same work. While this is really nice for some people, designers of these programs and policies need to really understand that statistically speaking, most people don't agree to these assignments for the benefits. Most employees are accepting expatriate assignments for the career and growth opportunities that it provides to them. Best practice that I think is pretty standard is finding these employees who have successfully completed expatriation policy or programs in the past and doing kind of exit interviews. So really digging into what they did well, how they felt about the experiences, what they feel the employer did well for the expatriates, as well as what they feel the employer could have done better for the expatriate. Other ways of utilizing these successful employees are by sending them on other expatriate assignments in the future and using them as mentors for first-time assignees. Another best practice is for firms to recognize the importance of family in an expatriation stay. So we discussed that the number one cause of assignment failures is employee and or family failure to adapt to the new culture. There are expatriate and family programs that are set in place by many employers that help everyone involved kind of gain a better understanding of the culture that they're going to be immersed into. So things such as values, cultural norms, business culture, and day-to-day life are taught in these training programs. Once the expatriate and family have moved and settled into the assignment country, successful businesses continue to provide in-country coaching so that they can kind of help aid the expatriate and their family along the way to make sure that they're still doing well throughout the assignment. And another best practice, is to consider the overall potential for happiness of all expatriates. This ties into things like cost of living and quality of life, which I talked briefly about in the last presentation. According to worldatwork.org study, traditional long-term and short-term expatriates have a higher quality of life compared to international commuters or those on extended business travel. So reasons for this are associated with extended hotel stays for those extended business travelers as opposed to establishing a new home for yourself as an expatriate. The next best practice is pretty important, I think. This is to improve international HR employee assistance. So we're talking about in the home country as well as in the host country for your expatriates. This is a big opportunity that a lot of firms still manage not to tap into. Worldatwork.org's study has found that assignees tend to speak to management, families, and other peer groups on assignment-related issues, even though HR is really the department that organizes and should have the resources available to be helping these expatriates and aid them along the way. So now that we've recapped what we talked about last time, we're going to talk about some of the necessary components that go into an expatriation policy. First and foremost, you'll want to define the policy host and home countries for the business. After defining the host and home countries, you'll want to determine the contract approval process, and the contract approval process requires the host country to draw up employment offers, which includes the salary, the benefits, the job description for that host country. Something else to determine in your expatriation policy is the standard assignment period. So there should be a maximum of about probably 5 years, not to exceed more than 5 years. And a termination policy should also be in your expatriation policy. Most companies offer a relocation allowance as an incentive for the employee to take the job offer. So relocation policies also cover moving arrangements, generally speaking, which is probably pretty good because moving across the country or to a different country is probably pretty expensive. Another aspect of the policy that is meant to protect both the employee and the employer is a commitment to return clause. In this clause, the company in question makes no legal commitment to rehire the employee in the employee's home country once they repatriate back into their home country. Likewise, the employee in question is under no legal obligation to return to the same company in their home country once they return. So this is not to say that most companies and employees part ways after successful expatriation and repatriation. It really just kind of clarifies there's no legal obligation for either party, and this is probably a policy that was needed at some point and was not there, so they just make these clauses to like kind of cover themselves, basically. Of course, a work visa and then family visas, where applicable, are necessary for expatriation assignments. Many policies include language lessons, stipends before the time of expatriation, orientations into the new culture, as well as a preview trip. I think that would be pretty handy in knowing kind of what you're getting yourself into. So you can go preview where you're going to be staying or, just kind of the general area, get a feel for it. There are lots of other benefits that companies with good expatriation policies outline within their policy. There are things like children's education, temporary housing, car rentals, socialization techniques, among other things that a lot of policies outline. So now I want to kind of talk about, do a small discussion, talk to you about the parts of the expatriation policy that you guys think will have a lasting impact on the success of an employee's expatriate assignment. So let me pull up my discussion. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and read my prompt here. So a multinational IT firm whose home location is based in Cincinnati, Ohio, is attempting to establish better expatriation policies as an initiative to increase the potential for success for the company's expatriates. In the past, expatriate failure rate has been pretty high, and expatriates often leave the company due to the nature of the experience abroad. The company hopes that increasing the rate of success for expatriates will reduce the training and turnover costs as well as the need for additional expatriate costs. So I have a few questions broken out, and we'll just kind of have a discussion about kind of the policies. So the first question is, what are some of the biggest factors that lead to expatriate assignment failures that we've discussed in my training discussions?
What I got from them is that basically failure to adapt to the new location for the expatriate or the families. They fail. They don't adapt well to the new culture.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So a lot of stress is placed on spouses and dependents a lot of the time to kind of learn these new cultural norms. And expatriates may kind of experience guilt as a result when their families aren't adapting the way that they want, that they hoped that they would. So that can place a lot of strain on the family, and a lot of times, I think understandably so, people will choose their family over their job, and that's when the expatriate assignment fails. So that is the biggest reason, for sure. The next question that I have, what is the main factor that you think would most impact your experience as an expatriate, and why?
For sure, the language barrier. I wouldn't do well not being able to communicate with the people around me.
Yeah, definitely. I think answers probably would vary for a lot of people, but for me, it would also probably be the language barrier. I would definitely need whatever company was, expatriating me to provide training, language classes, and then cultural training. I would definitely need cultural training. I think it would be a really hard adjustment to make if you don't understand the cultural norms. I know that in a lot of places doing business is just completely different. You can't shake hands, or touching is commonplace in certain places, whereas it's disrespectful in others. So I think cultural training is probably a really big deal that I would for sure need. The next question, let's see. How do cultural norms play a role in one's ability to adapt to the new culture?
Well, I just think that if you don't know the cultural norms, you're not going to be able to adapt to that new culture. You need to. It kind of goes along with the previous questions.
Mm-hmm.
You need to know those cultural norms, hopefully, before you get there, to be able to, adapt to the people around you, the environment around you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in order to thrive, I think, and to be able to become on good terms with your colleagues, you have to be able to understand the, I guess, societal values and cultural, we were talking about cultural norms. We have to understand those because we have to know how to interact with the people around us in a professional setting as well as in a personal environment, outside of work. Because if we're saying and doing things that would be inappropriate there, but are normally considered appropriate in our own cultures, they're not going to know that. They're just going to know that we're being inappropriate in their culture, and that's all that matters to them at that point. Let's see, what's the next question? So, this next one, keeping in mind the best practices we discussed in today's training session, let's make a mock expatriation policy, pretty just kind of quick one. And then let's explain our reasoning behind each aspect. So the policy should include host and home countries, who approves contracts, to include salaries, benefits, job description, standard assignment periods, termination policies, relocation allowances if applicable, social, cultural training, immersion, and lessons, like language lessons, for instance, and then education policy. So let's go ahead and just talk briefly about some of the things that would be outlined in this expatriation policy. So for host and home countries, basically we would just apply, the home country is wherever that policy is being made, right? So
Cincinnati.
For this place it's Cincinnati, Ohio, for this IT firm. And then the host country is anywhere where you have the international, territory. So if you have offices in China and Singapore and Spain, I don't know, then your host country could be at any number of those places. So who approves these contracts? Salaries, benefits, job descriptions. Who would you think would be, in charge of these kinds of things?
HR should be, but you did say a lot of times the employees go to managers who aren't really in charge of the expatriates.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's true. They do definitely go to people that they shouldn't necessarily be going to. Their managers, I don't know if that's just because they're closer with them than HR. They maybe feel more comfortable with their managers, but HR is really the source. Like, they're the key component to the expatriation policy, because the manager's not going to know they might know the policies, but they don't create them. They don't implement them. So definitely it would be HR. Probably one of the highest people in HR, like a VP or CHRO, would be the person that would be implementing these policies. Salaries for expatriation should be probably like 1.5 times the amount of the home location, but that also, you have to take into account the cost of living in the home location, and then kind of compare that to the cost of living wherever the host country is. And then you have to apply that as an incentive to motivate those employees to stay there successfully, and then also provide other benefits on top of that. So the standard assignment period, we discussed briefly, very briefly, it should be a max of no more than 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think would be like a comfortable, not too long, where you just feel like you're completely...
I feel like a year would be a little, it's not, not enough. Maybe 2 to 3 years.
2 to 3 years
would be a good
time
amount of time
for those. Yeah, I guess it just really varies depending on what the job is. But 2 years, 3 years is probably, I think that's about average for an expatriate policy, or an expatriate assignment.
I would hope that it would be 2 or 3 years, especially if it was with a whole family rather than like a single person.
Mm-hmm.
Those kids need time to adapt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they can't just bounce around. Yep,
yeah.
Definitely. There's, I think less potential for burnout. And then, as needed, if they're doing fine and they feel great about it, which can happen. I don't think it happens as often as places would like it to, but there are opportunities to potentially extend your stay if you need to, or if you want to, if you feel like you want to keep doing the work that, or your assignment hasn't been finished or something like that. So the termination policy, I don't know that we really talked much about the termination policy, but basically, termination policy is where the um, expatriate would need to notify its company that they're going to be terminating their expatriation stay, basically. So I think it's pretty standard to have like 90 days notice. I'm going to be leaving in 3 months, and in that event, normally they're leaving the company as well. So they do have a 90-day time frame wherein they need to find someone else to either fill that position or absorb it. Let's see, relocation allowances. What do you think is do you think that's kind of reasonable to have relocation allowances? And
yeah, I mean, when you're in the military, they pay when they're moving you, they pay for you to go. They pay for your, all your stuff to get shipped, your cars and travel and all of that. Yeah, I definitely think that should be covered.
It's necessary, right? It's very expensive to, move from Alaska to Washington is expensive. I can't imagine moving from somewhere in the United States to a completely different country, how expensive that has to be.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty reasonable, and that's probably something that they should definitely, everyone should be considering in their expatriation policies. Air and car travel, I think, are also included, so that includes rental cars and hotel stays. Those hotel stays would be after you've packed up your house and you haven't yet moved. They would cover that hotel stay, but then they would also cover any hotel stays needed once you got to your host country before you actually got into your home. So I think a lot of places do pretty well about covering these types of things to incentivize these employees. I think they're trying really hard to incentivize employees to make it a successful expatriation stay because a lot of the time before now it just hasn't been very successful.
I think that's probably the easy part is paying for these things, paying for the relocation expenses and paying them more money, but sounds to me like they need to focus more on the emotional side of it and adapting and those things like language classes and
I think
for them to really get their money's worth, everyone, the expatriates and the company, they need to get their money's worth and really make it a positive thing.
Positive experience, and I think that's why Mexico and Ecuador were so highly ranked, which I think was kind of surprising to me. But I think quality of life, I believe in Ecuador was considered to be really good, and that's why Ecuador has such good expatriation success rates there. And then I think cost of living as well, which we touched really briefly on. But quality of life plays hugely into the success of an expatriation stay. So if you don't have a good quality of life, personal finances, things like that, those all tie into it. Yeah. But you have to definitely be happy and feel confident in the culture that you're in. Feel like you're able to stay there. So I think you're right, definitely. And then this next part of it was basically what we're talking about right now, but social, cultural training, and then kind of that immersion aspect, and then any training, lessons, language lessons, things like that. What do you think would be really helpful, besides the language that we just talked about?
Probably counseling. I mean, for the expatriate and the family, probably. I think it would be good for them to have counseling and, just to see if they can handle it, or if maybe it wouldn't be a good fit before actually leaving.
Yeah.
I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, kind of to assess where they're at.
Yeah.
See how they feel about it. I don't honestly know, anything about it, but it's just if somebody's really skeptical about it, and there's children involved, and it's just definitely not going to be as easy if you don't have a good head about it, like if you don't have a good mindset about it beforehand.
Don't waste the money and go.
Because it's not going to only be like very expensive for the employer and probably for the employee. It's going to be really emotionally taxing and probably really hard on your family, and probably not worth it in the long run.
Yeah.
So I can imagine that's probably really hard.
Yeah.
And then in terms of education, do you think it's reasonable to have like paid childcare or paid schooling?
Yeah. Especially like in different countries where the kids aren't used to it. I know, like, my mind goes to like China. Isn't there like American schooling in China so that those, you know, it's the children are getting like consistent education, not just throwing them into a whole new
culture.
Yeah.
Like everything. Yeah.
Learning style, everything.
Yeah.
So yeah, that makes sense. And
I think it's reasonable for sure. I think that a lot of places go so far as to like pay for the like private like good schooling because it's
and
necessary.
Even if they weren't going to pay for it, like if you're going to give them more money in their salary and so that they can pick their own or whatever, I still think that it should be, you know, the company should research it and find the best education in that country for those expatriates' children.
Yeah, and then like just providing them options so that they don't feel
so that they don't have to do all that research. That's probably a huge stressor.
Yeah, for sure. So just like providing them with all of this information so that they can be informed and then make their own informed decisions at that point. Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, that kind of wraps up the discussion portion. Do you have any questions off the top of your head? Anything you can think of?
No, I think you pretty much covered.
Do you
everything? Yeah.
Feel better a little bit about like your understanding of expatriation?
I know what it is now.
Okay, cool. Well, I think that was a good discussion. I think a little bit better than I anticipated. So, thank you for coming to my training program, and I hope you learned some valuable information throughout the course of this semester. And thanks for joining me.